Rated T for Teen.
Each year, thousands of adults lose their shred. It's an epidemic simply known as shred loss. But it doesn't have to be this way. Because rekindling your shred is as easy as playing the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4. With new parks, cross-platform multiplayer, and sick new game modes, we can put an end to shred loss everywhere. Get the new Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and show the world that the shred's not dead. Pre-order Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 and play the Foundry demo.
This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-bodied pale ale brewed with sustainable kernza grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide, visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
Hello, and welcome to episode 257, something about the Beatles. And this was something that, it was last summer that I put this out there. And it might have even been your suggestion, Gary. I can't remember if it was or it wasn't. But, you know, in the previous iteration of the show, we did at least one episode of questions from listeners. And it just was the kind of thing that was not revisited because you move on to other topics and other guests and books and things like that. So it was something that I long wanted to get back to, so to speak. And with you, Gary, we've done the Olympiad shows. And just for anybody wanting to know, or you're coming late to this and wondering, who the hell is Gary? Looking frantically on your library shelves for a book by Gary Wenstrup coming up dry. Gary has joined me for ongoing Beatle Olympiad discussions, as you know. He's also an adjunct professor in Chicago, teaching history of Beatles class. He's lectured at over 100 public libraries, as have I, only he does it on pop rock artists, and I do strictly Beatles. But anyway, if you're interested in Gary's stuff and his gigs, GaryWenstrup.com is the place to go. And that's WENSTRUP, Wenstrup.
Thanks, Robert.
Is that accurate?
Yep, you got it. Thank you.
Couldn't have written it better yourself.
Let's move on.
Anyway, wanted to do the question show, and so I solicited on the Facebook page for anybody who's got any questions to send them to whatever the address was. I can't remember what the email address is, but when I post this show, I will repost that because I absolutely want to keep the questions coming. And I know some of you had multiple questions, but you only threw in one. So that was like July last year, and I am incredibly tardy in getting to this, but as you know from listening to this show, there's been a lot of stuff that's popped up. So, you know, you have to move on certain things when they happen, and some things excite you more than others. But I never meant to dodge the questions. And I'd also talked about fan encounters. We had Lawrence Stewart last year with Paul Ramone, and somebody who saw Paul at Glastonbury. I do want to get to that. I'm sorry it has taken to this point where there's been no follow-up, and it's not your fault. It's my fault. So I will circle back on that. There was the lawyer solicitation. I did get one, but the wheels are moving very slowly on that, but it will be worth it because this person has a very, very interesting take on the Beatles' end-of-band litigation as well as the non-legal aspects of end-of-band scenario, which is very, very interesting. We'll get to that when that person is good and ready. But in the meanwhile, we have this going on now. So I was very happy to see the kind of questions you guys were writing in with. It was all very smart stuff. And anyway, I guess, Gary, you want to kick it off with one that I think we've talked about on the show. Well, I know we've talked about on the show before, but again, if you're late to the table, late to the discussion, you may have missed it, and it's buried in the middle of a show somewhere. So fire away, Gary, and I'll give you my response.
Great. Before I get started, I just want to say in a lot of these notes to you, Robert, with questions, listeners were very complimentary of the show. And I'll just read one, and then I won't reference them going forward. This comes from Stephen Clement. He says, "Thanks so much for providing all of us such an interesting, thoughtful, and entertaining exploration of the greatest brand that ever was." And I couldn't agree more. And with that, we'll get into the questions.
We'll phone you.
So Trevor Krause asks, who sings the Oz in A Day in the Life? And of course, this is the part of the song where we move out of Paul's bridge and into the final third verse. One of the things I love about your listeners, Trevor even comes prepared with a quote. It just shows how smart your listeners are. And that Paul at one point said, quote, "I seem to remember that we all sang it, but I was definitely in there." So, Robert, your thoughts on who sings the Oz in A Day in the Life?
All right. It's interesting that this is one of those touch points in Beatle lore that people get really vehemently dug into their positions on. A lesser example might be who plays the guitar solo on Hey Bulldog. It's another one of those things where this is a pattern I noticed, and I'm saying this as an observation, okay? And depending on what side you fall in the debate, people can get very, very heated about this sort of thing. But it seems like a lot of times when there's some question about who did something in Beatle history, the people that are the John partisans seem to be the most emotionally invested in, absolutely, it was John, 100%, blah, blah, blah. I've noticed that as an observation. And make of that what you will. I think that is a whole show unto itself, wanting to analyze, like we've talked about this on previous shows, I think, how the internet seemingly has been seeded with a lot of completely made up quotes put in the mouth of John Lennon. That one, "You don't understand life," that whole, you're writing a paper for school and a teacher telling me you got it wrong, that whole thing. Absolute nonsense. Somebody show me the evidence of him ever uttering that. It doesn't even sound that much like him, but it's full of things like that. So there's absolutely this sort of quasi-religion that's been built up around John Lennon. And I think we know where a lot of it got started, but it has taken on a life of its own. And I do find often that when there's a question of who did this in Beatles history, if you were inclined to come down on favoring John with the credit, that any challenge, you'll respond with "end of discussion," which is a great way of providing evidence for your position, but whatever. So in this case, it's been this frequently discussed thing, who is it, John or Paul? A Day in a Life, in the minds of way too many fans, is considered a John song, even though it is a Lennon-McCartney thing. Not only for Paul's contribution to that whole bridge section, but also the whole thing hinged on "I'd Love to Turn You On," which was Paul's thing. And not to mention the creative input for the orchestra buildup and everything else about the way it's put together. It's not to take anything away from John, okay? It's not a zero-sum thing. Just trying to attribute things accurately. I would recommend to anybody who's interested in anything the Beatles did in the studio to check out the 5 volumes of the Beatles Recording Reference Manual series by Jerry Hammack, who is a producer, arranger, musician, engineer, and super hardcore Beatle fan who has done the work and dug into this stuff, far superseded the work of other people who've gone into this with graphs and all kinds of things to break down as close as you can get to being in the room with the Beatles when they recorded this stuff. It's probably way beyond a level of information for a lot of people in terms of what kind of mics they used and the placement and limiters and all kinds of electronic gear. However, he's done it with the discipline of a forensic pathologist to break things down. And when he doesn't know something, he will tell you he doesn't know. He'll tell you what instruments were available to be used on the session, but if he hasn't got smoking gun evidence, he will say so. Anyway, we had this discussion on the show with musician Luther Russell as well, who's a producer himself. And Jerry answered it really well. And I will stick that audio excerpt at the end of this episode so you can hear it in detail. It goes on for about 10 minutes, I think, including isolations, so you can hear for yourself. But no matter what people who were there, and Jeff Emmerich was one of these people when he wrote his memoir that I've called into question numerous times on the show for good reason. I don't think you could take that as a primary source, even though he was there, simply because the waters have been so muddied by his bad memory by the time he got around to writing that book. There's other people who've worked on this stuff, like Giles Martin, who on Twitter comes out with his pronouncement on it, that is belied by the own evidence, photographic evidence that was posted by Sam O'Cal, his partner, that contradicts it directly. So listen to what Jerry has to say and why he has to say it, and there you'll find your answer. Okay? But I will tell you this, Paul's quote is pretty spot on. And as George once said, the answer is at the end.
All right, then. Let's move on to the next one. This comes from Graham Wong. And Graham wants to know how the Beatles could afford to stop performing live. He makes the point that that's how most bands make their money, is performing live. So how could the Beatles afford to stop playing live?
That's a really good question. In fact, I think I pointed it out in my Revolver book, not to ring that bell, but it's something that when you do the research, you recognize that, we all kind of know in Beatle lore that this was a contract that was so unbelievably one-sided and not in the Beatles' favor. They would have to sell, based on a penny per 2 songs on a single, they would have to sell 1 million copies for them each to pocket £750. So it was ridiculous. Suffice to say, in the 60s, the Beatles were not making tons of money on their record sales, although their record sales obviously were record-breaking, no pun intended, and extremely good. But where they made their real money was on live performances. And this is something that, for all the beating up on Brian Epstein people do about bad business deals and things like that, giving away the wealth they could have had from merchandising, the 90% going to the guy that they had to later on try to claw back. But yes, he lost them lots of money in some ways, but right out of the gate, when he pulled them out of the clubs and started putting them in theaters and doubling their fee at the Cavern, things like that, he was definitely recognizing that they were being underpaid and to get them something commensurate with what he thought they were worth. So by the time they were playing stadiums, Shea Stadium being the first stadium show, but even before that, DC in 64, the Coliseum there, when the top ticket prices were something like $650 or something, which is ridiculous by modern standards, and that was a bill where you got usually 3 or 4 acts. In dollars adjusted for inflation, they were making really good money. You look back at like 1964 tour, they're doing 26 shows or something like that. It's a grind. And by the end of it, they'd cleared $1 million, and that's in 60s money. Today, that would be closer to 10 million, at least 7.5 million. So that was big, tall money they were making by being on the road, doing something that was not particularly satisfying to them over time. Once they kind of got over the novelty of it and all the thousands and thousands of screamers and stuff like that. I looked up for my own benefit when they played White Sox Park in Chicago in 65. They cleared $155,000 for 2 shows and what was it, like less than an hour's worth of work, really? In 2023, you adjust that for inflation, it's $1,474,472.28 for a single day's work. And you multiply that times all the shows, starting with Shea, which they made more money for because it was a bigger venue, and everywhere else they played on that tour. So for them to give it up in 66, and yeah, it had been unsatisfying. They couldn't hear themselves. They felt they were degrading themselves as musicians. And by that last tour, we've got all the horror stories of playing on a wet stage in a downpour, being locked in a truck for, half hour or whatever it was because the crowds wouldn't let them out of the venue, things like that. They'd reached their limit, but look at the sacrifice monetarily they were making to give up that revenue stream. And yes, in 1967, January 67, the deal with EMI was adjusted, something more favorable. And it would become even more favorable to give the devil his due when Klein came on board in 69. To try to get them something closer to what they were worth to the record label. But yes, touring, they did it because that was what you did back then. Nobody subsisted strictly on the sales of their records. You had to make live appearances. And the whole world changed. Touring changed within a couple of years, where it was much more in favor of the artists where they could hear themselves and deals were more lucrative and all that stuff. So the Beatles quit it when it was probably at its worst, where it had advanced to the point where they're playing super big venues, but still operating with their 2-man road crew and all that. It hadn't changed in 62. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Keith Richards that said something like, the Beatles quit touring 15 minutes too soon or something like that, making the point that things got a lot better for the artist not that long after.
To pick up a little further on Graham Wong's question, it's interesting that when the Beatles talk about why they stopped touring, no one ever mentioned the financial aspects of it at all, which is fascinating.
No, they didn't tend to talk about that. And as we know, per Revolver's opening track, the tax burden on them in England was unbelievable.
90+%, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't know how it works off the top of my head in terms of income earned abroad. I would assume it's subjected to British taxes bringing that money back into the country. But it was at that juncture, 65, 66, where Brian is starting to cast around for tax shelters, ways to protect their income. And Apple, the setup of Apple in Brian's lifetime, was originally conceived as a way to shelter their income before it became this big, grandiose Western communism thing. Every single platform out there, publishing and film and electronics and all that stuff, that wasn't originally what it was set up for. It was originally just to protect their income.
One more follow-up question to what Graham submitted to you, and that is, correct me if I'm wrong, the Beatles were allowed to record at EMI free of charge.
Yeah, that was part of their initial deal. I described it as one-sided. When you consider what EMI wanted out of them, and as we know now, it was the fruit born out of the failed Decca audition was they're playing 3 original tunes in that 15-song set. And what really got them on EMI's radar was Ardmore and Beechwood was a music publisher connected to EMI when Brian went to the HMV store on Oxford Street to get that Decca tape made into acetates so he could bring them around to the labels he was shopping them to, who were more likely to have a record player in their office rather than a reel-to-reel tape machine. And a guy there who was cutting the lathes heard the tunes, thought they were good, brought them to the attention upstairs to the guy that was working for Ardmore Beechwood, the music publisher, and that's where he's like, hey, you guys write this stuff, this is good, I'll put in the word for you at EMI. And there was no takers initially, but that was what got them attention, the fact that they wrote original tunes. So when EMI signed them, it was less with the expectation that they're going to sell millions and millions of records than it was, hey, they've got in-house writers that we can publish and we could shop their tunes around to our other roster of artists.
Right. The songwriting was key. One last question. So the Beatles were able to record at EMI without being charged for studio time. Was that an unusual contract, that arrangement? Or was that kind of par for the course back in the day? Do you know?
It was standard boilerplate because it didn't cost much. They were contracted for, I think it was 6 sides, which means 3 singles. It might have been 4, but I think it was 6. But EMI was under no obligation to release those records.
Right.
It cost them very little just to track them. As you know, the eventual Please Please Me album was done in a day. So it wasn't like they were lavishing a big budget on this stuff. Please Please Me got greenlighted simply because the single of the same name was a hit, a big hit, top 2 or top 1, depending on which chart you look at. Love Me Do did well enough to justify the second single. So if either of them had stiffed, it might not have been in the cards for them to record an album for EMI.
Yeah. All right. We're going to do a big time change here, time leap. This is John Coter from Canada. He says, we've all done the 1970 album, meaning what would that look like? And songs like What is Life, Right After God, and then Maybe I'm Amazed. His question is, what would an album look like after the contract expired in 1976?
This is the kind of question where you have no empirical evidence or data to go by. You feel it out based on what you know and who these guys were and what was more the industry standards of the time. Now, we know in the 60s that you were locked into this grind of a couple albums per year, X amount of singles a year. That stuff had relaxed by the turn of the decade. So if you look at their own practices, they generally put out, for a lot of years, at least for the first half of the decade, 1 album per year. And sometimes it took a little bit longer, like the lapse between All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World, for example, although he did do a triple live album in between for the Bangladesh benefit. Paul was good for an album a year. He slowed down a little bit after the success of Band on the Run, because that was a year that had 2 albums, Red Rose Speedway and then Band on the Run at years, and he rode that throughout 74 before 75 putting out his next album, Venus and Mars. So that was pretty much the norm. Now, 76 was the year that the contract expired, such as it was with them as 4 individuals. The ramifications of that were EMI could put out Beatle material as they saw fit without approval from the band. So that's the year you start seeing rock and roll music, and then you see love songs, and then you see real music, and Beatles' greatest hits, all that sort of packaging that they had nothing to do with. It's likely that if EMI wanted John, Paul, George, and Ringo to do something, whether they call it Beatles or not, I'm thinking it would have been a lot looser of a thing. Maybe kind of what John and George were pushing for in 69, Beatles and Company, where they'd bring in supporting musicians of their own choosing and put it out under this umbrella brand And maybe a lot of it would have been like I'm the Greatest, where you're the primary composer and whoever is deemed the singer on it, plus whatever supporting cast, a Billy Preston. In that case, you had Klaus on bass. So presumably if they're doing it Beatles, you would have Paul in that role or whatever. So what would it look like? I'm thinking that there may have been some John and Paul collaborating by that time. When you look at their history, John, only after he has a number one album with a number one hit single, which is Walls and Bridges, only then does he start entertaining the idea of working with Paul again. And maybe the fact that he was apart from Yoko and her influence had something to do with that at that time. Because once he was back with her, it didn't happen in 1975. He never made that New Orleans trip. So I could see them possibly writing together or doing what they'd always done, which is, or had done for a long time. They write the songs individually, and then the other serves as editor and polishes them up and makes suggestions and all that stuff. Where George would have fit into that equation, maybe things would have been looser. Maybe, as had been his pattern during the last year of their operations, where the stuff that's very personal, the all things must pass and beware of darkness and stuff, he keeps that for himself and only brings in the most commercial material, a Something or Here Comes the Sun, to share with the other Beatles and get their input on. I could see something like that happening. I don't know that Ringo would necessarily have stepped up as a songwriter by that point, as he did in real life, particularly when he started writing with Vinnie Poncia. Maybe he would have, if the Beatles had recorded something, that's his songwriting partner, that would have been okay. Who knows? Or maybe Paul and or George, like Photograph, would have been his songwriting partner for a project of that nature. I think if they'd made something after 76 and put it out under the collective Beatles brand, it wouldn't have been like the 60s. I think they would have brought in whoever they wanted to be on it, and they may or may not have collaborated, or it'd be different iterations of collaboration between them. But definitely, if you're going to do it and call it Beatles, I don't think it would have been like some of the stuff they did in the 60s, particularly the White Album, where one or two of them might have gone off on their own to record something. I think there would have been that overlap in performances, because I'm presuming that they still would have had the outlet to do their own thing at the same time, which is now the precedent. That's not what bands do. They return to the mothership every so often, but they do their little solo excursions. It doesn't mean they're broken up with finality. They're just doing their own thing, and then they get back, because I think the Beatles, at least subconsciously, recognize the Beatles brand as distinct from their individual brand. Maybe Paul least of all. I think they were kind of interchangeable for him when you look at the way he was not shy about dictating exactly the way he wanted something played on a song he brought in. But it's all speculation. That's my take.
Okay. I must say there's so much speculation there that I can't even wrap my head around it. I cannot even fathom what a Beatles album would have looked like in 1976. I can't even go there. It's a bridge too far for me.
I'm waiting for the day, and I know it'll happen probably in our lifetimes, that Universal will start putting out thematic compilations of solo material. A 1974 album is a brilliant idea with the songs that they all put out that year. You could take the 3 best songs from each of them and make a solid collection out of it.
Absolutely. I totally agree. The idea of them all working together in 1976 as a peaceful, collaborative, supportive unit is just hard for me to wrap my head around.
I think it's the kind of thing where, well, obviously it didn't happen, and they were all they were all operational as artists. It would have taken slight changes in events for it to be a thing amenable to all of them, where it was not a bitter aftertaste or feeling too much of the pressure of living up to the Beatles legend at that point. That seems to be the biggest thing that kept them from doing it, even after John and Paul had largely repaired their friendship and whatever issues were going on with the rest of them. Ringo seemed to be getting along with everybody, but you look at some of the interviews in the press from 76, 77 from him, he's the one pushing away the idea of a Beatle reunion.
Let's just discuss the Beatles getting together very briefly. Is it impossible?
Right now, it's impossible.
Is it impossible even in the studio, apart from a concert? That's the obvious thing you can do.
People think we can get, okay, it's Friday now. It's Friday. What day is it?
It's Monday.
Right. Well,
you knew it was near to the weekend.
Well, right. Any day. Monday to Friday is the weekend. To get together, it's going to take 6 months. It's not like we can get together on Tuesday and perform on Wednesday. It's silly, and all these people, I don't understand it. That's my problem. I don't understand why all these people are putting full-page ads and things and saying, well, my name is this and my name is that. If it gets together, we will get it together. We will tell you it's getting together.
Maybe it's still too raw, the downside of Beatlemania. Certainly would have been for George. George, you had to catch him in absolutely the right moment, because as much as he talks about, I'd never be in a band with Paul McCartney again, but I would join a band with John Lennon any day. I've always found that a really curious quote, because if there's anybody he had less reason to work with in the Beatles, it was certainly John, in terms of his not only absence from the recording sessions, which isn't as complete as some people think, but it was there enough that it was a pattern, as well as the outright disdain that we know about simply from the Get Back sessions when George would bring in a new song or complain that they were too complex for him to play. This is the guy that George wants to be in a band with, but Paul, who works endlessly on his stuff, he's the one that he says musically he comes on too strong, he's a bit overbearing. Certainly that's true. And once you've gotten the freedom to work with whoever you want to, it'd be a hard thing to go back to. It's like when he walked out at Twickenham, I think conditions would have to be met before he would find himself in the studio with Paul McCartney again. Again, it's speculation on my part. I think they worked really well together when they were able to get rid of the baggage between them, as they did on Abbey Road. When John wasn't there for the first week or so of the July sessions, they were incredibly productive, and the work is amazing. They were on the same page musically, but George, by nature, was a bellyacher about a lot of things that maybe he should have recognized the positivity, how hard a Paul McCartney is working on your tunes to elevate them. That's no small thing.
One of the things you and I discussed about the George and Paul relationship and John is that John encouraged George's input on his songs.
Yes.
So George felt like a creative partner to John, where George did not feel that way to Paul. Paul was not interested in George's creative input. And I think that made a big difference to George.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was what made working with John so much more attractive, because if you look at the footage from the Imagine sessions and he's freely offering input and it's being taken up, how refreshing.
Yeah, agreed.
And you could just talk to any of the guys in Wings about how did that go.
Yeah, right. All right. John has a second part to his question. We're going to leap forward another 10 years to 1985. If John were alive, would he have done Live Aid?
As a soloist, I wonder, or as part of some put together Beatle reunion. You know, they turned down the Kampuchea thing in 79 when Kurt Waldheim of the United Nations was floating a Beatle reunion to help the boat people, as it were. And he was quite caustic, John was, about the burden of saving the world being put on the Beatles once again. Who knows by the mid-'80s how his life would have turned, and there's been tons of speculation about that. In general principle, he was not averse to benefits, although I shouldn't say that he was not averse to them. He did do what he did in 72, the one-to-one show, and he did do the Labor Day telethon, and he talks in the Playboy interview about tithing, about giving away a percentage of his income to charity, blah, blah, blah. Something like that, I think, would have been a really hard thing to sit out. In terms of, yeah, they'd always talked about the pressure being Beatles and people expecting miracles from them, but with an array of artists that huge, like a global scale on 2 continents, Phil Collins doing the playing in London, then taking the Concorde over and playing in Philadelphia too. There was so much to get out of that thing in terms of generating goodwill and being part of the rock community, newer acts as well as established artists. It just seemed like it would be such a weird thing to sit out. And, Paul did show up. George was traveling and I guess didn't get asked. It would have been a nice nod to him for kind of setting that precedent with Bangladesh, but he wasn't super active recording at the time, so I could see how he'd get overlooked. But it would have been an amazing thing. Would John play? Depending on the state of his marriage, it might have been a John Yoko show in 1985. I'm not sure where they would have been at, because presumably if he hadn't been killed, he'd still be recording. We don't know, but maybe. Yoko kept recording during the 80s, of course, and toured. She played live. I remember her doing a version of Imagine someplace in Europe. I saw the footage of that back in the day. But how do you not have a live John Lennon sing Imagine on that stage? Mm. It would have been nice to be joined by other Beatles. or give peace a chance, something like that. I don't know. I don't see why he wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a nice way to look at it. And I think John, as we know, he wanted to tour post Double Fantasy.
Yeah.
So I think he would have gotten those stage jitters or gotten his act modernized. You know, he hadn't done any touring and the world and technology had changed so much. So if he had done the tour post Double Fantasy, I think he would have been in sync with live performing.
There's a lot about that, his announced plans and stage dress and all that stuff that he had been working on and conceptualizing. Yeah, for a 1981 tour. That obviously didn't happen. I do think it's a big question, though. If it was going to be a John and Yoko thing, would Geldof have gone along with that? He seems to be kind of a no-nonsense guy, so I wonder.
That's an interesting idea. For some reason, I think he would say, yeah, okay, go for it. Maybe a shorter time slot. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that. Okay. Another question, Blair Morgan. I'm just going to read hers directly. Lennon McCartney's relationship. Do we agree that their relationship needs to be covered off at a psychological level? Seems a bond that defies logic given the personalities. So that's sort of question one. And question two, who do we think is best placed to delve into writing about this in a way it never has before?
To the first question, absolutely. That's a big missing piece in Beatle historiography. I don't mean armchair shrinks like we've been on this show numerous times and on other podcasts. I mean people that actually know a thing or two about that. I can't name a name. I have read any number of really good psychohistories of political leaders. One of the first ones I read was a book, can't remember her name, it was a woman who wrote back in late 70s maybe, Richard Nixon, The Shaping of His Character. And there's been similar ones done on JFK and other people. Those things are amazing because if you're viewing things through the prism of human psychology, patterns arriving from the circumstance of your childhood and birth order and things like that. Who was it said, show me the child and I'll show you the man? That absolutely informs things that might not have an outward logic that surfaced decades later. But if you're trained and knowledgeable about seeing things and looking for the patterns and the circumstance that lead to a shaping in one direction or another, we done the show fairly recently, the Paul and George show, and somebody did a nice comment on the Satby page about birth order and how that shapes you temperamentally and psychologically going forward. And I'm not trained, and a lot of other people that talk about it are not trained, but it is an interesting thing when you have insight and data to base your opinions on that suddenly will shed light on something like that. So John and Paul, I would say for all four Beatles, and Brian, doing a deep, knowledgeable examination of them, I think would yield so much that would make seemingly things that don't make any sense make sense. I'm confident of that. I couldn't name you a name of who should do it, but it's out there waiting to be done. That's the new frontier of Beatle historiography, I think, going forward. We've done so much of the technical stuff. We've done so much analysis of the business and their music, God knows, all that. That's something very, very important. It's been done with other historic figures. And yes, some competent reading of the Beatles and analysis. And it shouldn't all be on one person, too, by the way. It's like anything else. Readers can judge for themselves when somebody presents something how well it resonates or makes sense to them. But yeah, absolutely.
Just a follow up to that, do you think it should be sort of a Beatle expert like yourself or a Mark Lewison, a Tim Riley, a Peter Doggett, or do you think it's someone that has to have a professional psychiatric background?
The latter, and I think that too often, I would say this of absolutely everybody, including myself, that your fandom can cloud your judgment, no matter how hard you try to maintain a critical distance. I think that just can't be helped. And it would be better somebody viewing them through their training as four individuals that were part of this collective with a collective identity that went through this unbelievable level of fame, adoration, scrutiny, all that sort of stuff that has a detachment from it. I think that would be the most beneficial thing. They would have to do the research because there's a ton to know. And you also have to know what to believe and what is nonsense.
Yeah.
Go with the hard data where possible and the most credible witnesses and judge by the actions. I think that there's absolutely enough data to work with to come up with some conclusions that will stand up. But I think there's been way, way, way too much, especially by people who knew them, reading into their psychological motivations and such that are no more valid than anything you and I can come up with. Sometimes the worst witnesses are the ones that were there.
The interest in John continues. Brian Harris asks, was Mimi a good parent to John? He says, I think we can confidently assert that she loved John and took raising him very seriously. But well into his adult life, John seemed to have the attitude that he could get away with murder if his apology was charming enough. Could Mimi have set firmer boundaries for him in childhood?
There is such thing as, it's a clinically diagnosable thing, a defiance. I can't remember what it's called, not a disorder necessarily, but something where a personality type, a temperament type, is purposely and consistently defiant against any situation you put them in. And impositions of boundaries, I think, and I say this as a parent as well, not just as a Beatle fan, I think only work so far depending on what you're dealing with. What will work for one kid is not going to work for another kid. And anybody that's a parent will recognize that. So Mimi did the best she could under the circumstances she was given to work with. She had not given birth to a kid of her own. She adored John. She gave him what by most standards everybody would consider a solid upbringing. He knew he was loved. He was provided for materially in terms of care and environment, of being directed to aspire to something worthy of his talents, which she didn't believe rock and roll or music to be, but that's hardly exceptional for her generation and place, right? She just wanted the best for him. She knew he was brilliant. She knew that he was special, as all parents do. And one could look at, well, if it wasn't Mimi, what if Julia had been the primary caretaker? How would he have ended up? And I guess you would look no further than his sisters, see how they ended up. It would have been a less stable upbringing for sure, I would suppose, and less material comforts and all that. I don't know if it would change the outcome. I think that John was born with the temperament that came from both of his parents. And there's only so much environmental influence could change about that. I don't think he ended up too bad. My only issue with John is that I think he was seriously troubled. He was certainly functional on a high level for most of his short life, but by 67, 68, where he's becoming an acid casualty, he's clearly self-medicating in the name of trying to deal with and heal something. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I have no training, or even to the extent of people that are drug experts that can make sense of somebody like him pursuing the things that he pursued. It's clear that he had some kind of psychological breakdown in 68, post-Brian. He'd been self-medicating on acid for a long time. And then they try to steer him into TM. He has a relapse. Next thing you know, he's on heroin. And he's completely consumed by his relationship with Yoko. The guy that existed from 68 onward is not the John Lennon of 64, 65. But he, in hindsight, made the observation he was depressed, he was fat. So it's clear that fame and fortune did not scratch the itch of whatever he was trying to cope with. So I would say of the four Beatles, he was the one that most profoundly might have benefited from some kind of psychotherapy. He did seek it out with the Primal stuff, something that was novel and exciting and different and all that.
Non-traditional.
Yeah, non-traditional, but he didn't complete it. So we don't know where he would have ended up if he'd completed the treatment before he went back to England. So it's clear, lots of speculation and discussion of the Dakota years, what went on then. Who was this emaciated guy emerging in 1980 with this tale of baking bread and child raising and all that stuff that is at odds with other things emerging from witnesses to that period of his life? So it's too bad that he never was given that opportunity to maybe address the issues he'd been carrying around. And certainly in his tellings, it was the trauma of his childhood, losing his mother, being abandoned by his parents, all that sort of thing that affected him going forward. And he spent a good deal of his adult years chasing the answer, ping-ponging around from one thing to the other. Past 68, Yoko was that thing. except for when it wasn't, during 73, 74, early 75. And after that, it became this narrative that they put out of their oneness, despite evidence of dysfunction that are clearly out there. What does one make of all that? I don't know. But I guess the fact that he was able to produce what he did, given those limitations, is pretty amazing. We've talked on the show before about artists and their psychological dysfunctions and issues that lead them straight into drug abuse, showbiz people generally. It seems that there's a lot of overlap in what motivates them to reach the heights that they do. What wounds are they trying to heal? So would a happy, content, well-adjusted John Lennon be the guy we knew? I don't know. But I don't think there's anybody out there that loves John Lennon that would want to see him suffering just so he could make records.
I mean, the whole pain leads to good art is something that's been debated through the millennia. My sort of thought about this question is my understanding of Mimi is that she was a very tough woman. Paul McCartney has talked about how she was a strong woman, and it would seem to me that she was very firm and set really strict boundaries, again, based on my knowledge and reading. And so I would not fault Mimi at all. I think John was just rebellious by nature.
That's what I mean. Whatever he inherited from his parents, even though he wasn't raised by them, I think was manifest in this defiance that he had. I can't fault Mimi. And as Ray Connolly has said on the show, yeah, she frightened people, but at heart, she was a softie. And people have said the same thing about John Lennon. You know, his caustic wit and the way he could just totally destroy somebody with a comment. But inwardly, he was sentimental and soft and inherently social and kind to people. But you catch him in the wrong mood or when he's all business, and he may strike you the other way. He wasn't like Paul, who was like endlessly charming to absolutely everybody.
Mm-hmm.
With John, you got the sense that what you see is what you get. Other people were struck by Paul as like, well, he's a show business phony, or he's just putting this persona on. He's playing Paul McCartney right now. It just depends on your point of view on that sort of thing. I think both of them were genuinely sociable people and innately kind-hearted, no matter what their behavior might show at any given moment. The stories of John Lennon's cruelty are manifest, but are you defined by your worst moments? It's just one part of who you are. I'm not trying to bend over backwards to defend John Lennon. I'm just saying it's complicated.
I think that's one of the reasons why John continues to have so much appeal is that authenticity of his. You know, Paul, incredible and incredibly charming, but John's realness, for lack of a better word, authenticity, I think is what makes him so fascinating.
That's what projects out. It's like a vulnerability beneath the bluster. And I think the times when Paul projects a vulnerability are far fewer.
Absolutely.
Which is not to say he's insensitive or unfeeling at all. And there's definitely moments where it comes through. I think that it is his nature to be protective and shielding of that side of himself. I don't think he likes putting it out there, where John had no problem doing that.
Yeah.
To a point. Which is not to say that John wasn't deceptive in what he projected about himself at all, but I do think on the whole, he was more comfortable with the warts and all side of himself being public than Paul was.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Moving forward, it's the Come Together lawsuit. Marty Jones from Maryland says, we know that Morris Levy sued for copyright infringement because Come Together lifted a line from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. Why does John bear the brunt of the lawsuit when Paul is also a co-writer?
I always thought that was kind of curious myself. Yeah, it's credited Lennon-McCartney, and I went looking for some answers on that just to see if there was some actual explanation. The best I can come up with, there's a couple books that I looked into. One was from 2016, Godfather of the Music Business, Morris Levy, by Richard Carlin, which states that, I guess when it first became an issue, John and Paul both acknowledged that John was the sole writer, and John took it upon himself to bear that burden. The other book is 2015, Stan Sucher, Baby You're a Rich Man, Suing the Beatles for Fun and Profit. It seems, per his telling, and of course by the time this surfaces, the Beatles are split and the Eastmans are calling the shots litigation-wise with Paul, is that a decision was made that Apple Records was a defendant in this case being presented, and that Lee and Paul wanted no part of it, and they purposely absented themselves. According to this book, Lee got a warranty, so any damages or costs would be borne by Lennon. That suggests a proactive effort to defend themselves and not get drawn into it, and John apparently indemnified him to the extent that, yeah, this is my problem, not yours, Paul, and that's the way it proceeded.
It's interesting that when the lawsuit comes up, Paul kind of washes his hands of Come Together when every interview post that time, when the lawsuit is settled, he's the first to tell you that he created the swampy bass lick that makes the song so attractive.
Yeah, well, even when the song was new in the initial interviews he does in 69, that is absolutely a point of pride with him. But it is also said that he, right away, when John brought it in, recognized, we can't do this like You Can't Catch Me. Let's slow it down at least. So he initially was onto that fact. I mean, the whole thing is silly, and I guess John made the case in court of how many times Flat Top was put out there independent of Chuck Berry, that it's a term in common use in pop culture, from Dick Tracy to any number of other things, other songs.
Got no dough, but just a nod. Gets the girl's door, it may seem odd. He's a real smooth lover in his whole hot rod. My boy, Flat Top.
And Here Come Old Flat Top. Those are the words that were lifted direct from Chuck Berry. Would James Taylor made a similar accusation against George for something in the way she moves? It's silly. It's pure greed. It wasn't Chuck Berry personally. I guess it was his publishers, and Morris Levy was the guy that was going to be the shark to go after any money-making opportunity. You know, it's just like if My Sweet Lord had stiffed, nobody would have touched him. But it became this mega hit all over the world, and that's what made it attractive to people who recognize they can carve out a piece for themselves. So you could point to any number of examples of Beatles borrowing things. I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man. Why did nobody, whoever wrote that Elvis recorded, Baby Let's Play House, why did they go after them for that? That's even more words.
I couldn't agree with you more. The fact that that became an issue because of the little line that John lifts, to me, is incredible. And the songs don't bear any similarity to each other in their sound or their feel.
No, it's purely a cynical move to make money. And artistically, I don't think John did anything wrong.
Agreed. Okay, we're going international now. Robert, Brendan Freehan from Melbourne, Australia, asked this. George had 3 songs on Revolver. It seemed he was building nicely. Was he caught napping to some extent when Pepper was being done? Or was he squeezed out by Paul's concept album idea and Paul's single-mindedness?
I don't think this was anything Paul did in this instance per se because of the concept of Pepper that was taking shape. If you recall, initially, for what was going to be their first post-touring album, to the extent that they had anything thematic sketched out, it was a look back at their childhood. And certainly the first few songs, Strawberry Fields, When I'm 64, Penny Lane, those were all sort of within that dynamic, that nostalgia thing. And had George come up with a nostalgic theme tune, I'm quite certain they wouldn't have rejected it unless it was really, really awful. You look at Revolver as this high watermark of him contributing to Beatles. So he'd been building over time throughout 65, going into 66 in terms of his contributions. With the Beatles, he's got one tune, Beatles for Sale, Hard Day's Night. He's got no self-penned material, but we know at 64 he had that You Know What to Do tune, which didn't make it very far, for good reason probably. 65 with Help, You Like Me Too Much, and I Need You. 2 fine Beatle-worthy contributions to that album. So now he's got one per side. Same thing with Rubber Soul, Think for Yourself, and If I Needed Someone. 2 fine, perfectly meshed. They're not like low points of the album or anything like that. And for people that said that it took him a long time to write on their level, I would absolutely argue that point. Because their level is all over the place. There's certainly album tracks they wrote that aren't anything remarkable. And I think that stuff he was contributing, it's all subjective, of course, but they're no embarrassments.
They're not embarrassments, but they're not single material either.
No, but not everything they recorded needed to be hit. I mean, I would argue that If I Needed Someone was as fine a single material in 65 as anything. And in fact, as you know, the Hollies did record it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it hadn't been undermined by George loudly talking about how lousy he thought it might have done better. But I think it was at least top 20. So going into 66, Revolver, Taxman, not only is it a fantastic track that benefited from input of all of them to varying degrees. Ringo's got a great drum performance on that song, as he does all over that album. Plus Paul's lead guitar, John contributing to the lyrics, and their backing vocals on it. So not only is it a solid band performance, but they deem it the opening track of the album. That's no small thing. That's huge. And as they get more and more experimental in their mid-career, what's more experimental than a completely non-Western mini raga rock tune that he contributes? Again, being way ahead of the curve, even though there's other Eastern influence creeping into rock throughout 1965, as we've talked about. And then this wonderful, as I know I ranked it high when we did our Olympiad, I Want to Tell You, is just this terrific, out of nowhere, sort of non-obvious rock tune where he's trying to express himself and his acid experience and feelings of inarticulation. It's a great tune. It's a great album track, if not a single, that's fine. So, yeah, it's a high watermark for him. And as we know, John had sort of spent himself right out of the gate when they started the sessions, was struggling to come up with another tune for the album. Finally, with a lot of help from George, She Said gets completed. So I think that was what opened the door to George getting 3 tunes on that. Now, in strict career terms, yeah, that's a high watermark. There's no going back after that. You've got a seat at the table in terms of being a high-profile, effective, successful contributor to Beatle albums. What happens between that and the start of the Pepper sessions is the Eastern fixation. Goes off to India. It changes his life. Suddenly rock and roll and being a Beatle. I mean, he'd made that remark months after Revolver was tracked, and just as it's coming out, as soon as I get on the plane for that last gig after Candlestick, I'm not a Beatle anymore. So maybe the signs were already there that he'd scratched that itch with Revolver, and if he was another person, another band, he probably would have used that leverage to carve out a bigger role for himself. Instead, he retreats. So I don't think Paul did anything to him per se. I think it was being a Beatle was certainly a diminished thing to him. Rock and roll was a diminished thing to him. He's all into the ancient culture of India and what that music means that gives him so much deeper satisfaction. Nonetheless, he's pushed to come up with something for the album or feels perhaps out of duty or obligation he needs to. Comes up with only a Northern song. I don't have a problem with that song. Even Lester Beatles is still Beatles as far as I'm concerned. And he gets told, you can do something better than that for this album, can't you, George? And maybe it hadn't been Pepper. Maybe it was just another album they were working on. It would have been sufficient. But then he digs deep, and where his headspace is at that time with the Eastern philosophy and Indian culture, comes up with a With You Without You, which even John gave props to. So as we know from, Paul would say later on, well, I don't remember George showing up for many of the sessions. He does take a back seat on that album. Maybe it was the concept. I think more likely it's just where he was in his own head that it just wasn't that important anymore. You know, he wouldn't stay in that space forever, but that's where he was then for Pepper. In Magical Mystery Tour, he's along for the ride, duly contributes a psychedelic tune to that, but ends the year working on Wonderwall, which obviously had a great deal more meaning and significance for him. That becomes sort of his last hurrah of Indian stuff after Inner Light early the next year, that whole period there, late 67, early 68. By the time they come back from Rishikesh, he suddenly discovered he's in love with guitar again and goes back to being a rock star and gets his one tune per side going forward.
Yeah, and to your point about a different headspace pre-Pepper, he gives quotes like he felt rejoining the Beatles after India felt like going backwards. Mm-hmm. He says he was losing interest in being fab, which is a great, dry, funny George Harrison comment. So that all makes perfect sense. Switching keys here. What were you, Robert, doing, and where were you when you heard that John Lennon had been killed?
It's an interesting question for people of a certain age, because it's one of those things that for people of an earlier age, the question was, where were you when you heard President Kennedy was shot, or something like that? So that was my JFK moment. And I was young, I was a teenager, and I was not a football fan then as now. So I know a lot of people got it through Monday Night Football. I've never seen a football game in my life. There are things I'm not interested in, and that's one of them. But I was working at a record store at the time, which I've mentioned on the show before, and it was struggling, and I didn't have a whole lot of hours, but it was still like a second home to me. And I was good friends with the owner, who was working 24/7 to keep it afloat. But I was at home. It was just past 10 o'clock in the evening, And a buddy of mine called up, apparently in their household, I think he got it from Monday Night Football. I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is what I remember. He said to me, John Lennon had been shot. And I didn't believe it.
WBBM TV, Channel 2, Chicago. Bill Curtis, Walter Jacobson, John Coughlin, Johnny Morris, with Chicago's #1 news. Channel 2, the 10 o'clock news.
The front page of tonight's New York Daily News captures an instant, a moment in time that will live on for the countless fans of rock star John Lennon. The photograph depicts Lennon autographing an album for his accused killer just hours before the murder. Good evening. Our top story tonight remains the assassination of former Beatle John Lennon. His wife, Yoko Ono, has announced there will be no funeral service for her husband. In a statement released today, Ono says, "We will set the time for a silent vigil to pray for his soul. We invite you to participate from wherever you are at that time. John loved and prayed for the human race. Please pray the same for him." Our coverage on Lennon's death starts tonight with a report from Phil Walters in New York.
Despite the steady rain here, the vigil continues. Last night, there was confusion and bewilderment.
I totally could not believe it. But as he was saying it, and I get now as an adult processing something overwhelming and out of the blue and just way too big to wrap your head around, people react to it different ways. Mine was denial. His was laughter. He was laughing about it because it was like it was the most crazy thing. Not in any way that he thought it was funny. And at the time, I didn't think he was thinking that, but it did make me think, what's going on? I could tell that he was serious. For whatever reason, I intuited that he wasn't pulling my leg. So I was at home. My bedroom was in the basement, and I immediately went down there and put on the stereo, and the station was playing at that moment. Now, it's probably about 10:15 at the latest. The song on the radio at that moment is "I'm Only Sleeping."
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. And as soon as it ends, it's dead air. It's not like right into the next song. I should point out that this was WXRT, and they fancied themselves as Chicago's fine rock station at the time, meaning they weren't top 40, they weren't classic rock at the time because it didn't exist, they weren't sort of middlebrow stuff. They were very esoteric, but it wouldn't have been out of line to play a 1966 Beatle track in their mix of Laurie Anderson or Joan Armatrading or Talking Heads or whatever hip stuff was happening at the time. So hearing that, I thought was a little strange, but not completely like weird. But then the dead air comes, and the DJ after that, you could tell he's distraught. And he's trying to get the words out and form his thoughts. And he said something like, "Would but that were only true." And then he proceeded to read from most recent to previous what had come over the news wire. So the first thing he reported was that John Lennon was dead, and then he backtracked to the earlier bulletin they got. John Lennon was shot in front of his New York apartment by a fan. And you know how early news reports tend to be wildly speculative. They said something like, "in a dispute over an autograph," which made it seem even more ridiculous. But I had presence of mind enough to throw a cassette in and record it. And I just let the tape run. So somewhere I have that. You hear part of "I'm Only Sleeping" and then all that stuff. I've got that somewhere. If I find it someday, maybe I'll post it, but it exists. It was the kind of thing where I was so much of a history geek, and I was already collecting newspapers at that time, that as much as this was probably the biggest psychological earthquake in popular culture to be imagined, that I had a complete intimate connection to, given my level of fandom, I was not so disassociated that I didn't think I should document this. And so the next thing I did was I immediately went off to the record store, which was closed, but it was a 5-minute drive away. My friend who owned it was doing work because they were basically putting together a new building. They'd moved from a smaller shop to one across the street, and they were still trying to get that up and running. But he had the radio on, of course, knew what was happening. I had access to a 10-pack of cassettes, and I just kept letting them roll all night long. And I pulled an all-nighter. What I did before I left the house, though, was I grabbed my stack of John Lennon albums, everything that existed, 2 versions through Double Fantasy, and brought them with me. I didn't even have like a clear-cut idea what I was going to do, and neither did he. He's like, oh, you got your albums. That's good. And I remember that he had like homemade cork boards on part of the walls of the store. And so I put them all up in order and then spent the rest of the overnight hours. I can't remember if I brought any books with me or if I was doing this strictly out of my head. I suspect I was doing it strictly out of my head. Started typing out John Lennon quotes on his typewriter in the office. And then eventually I cut them out and then pasted them up on this piece of cardboard and had that as like the centerpiece of this display of all John's albums. And that became like this little shrine in the store. And I remember making a conscious decision at the time not to take a picture of it. I just wanted it to exist in my head. I kind of regret that now, but that was what I did. And so stayed up the entire night. And I remember the next day knowing about this, not from real life, but from books. I found a piece of black cloth and made an armband, and I wore a black armband the next day. And what he told me was that when I wasn't at the store was that people just kept coming into the place paying homage to John, like just standing before this thing and taking it all in and just quietly soaking it all up and going on their way. So it became a focal point, and that was what I did. And it was years before I could face that night again in terms of I had a stack of cassettes of radio from that night. And that's the other thing I remember too, is that as different radio stations, I tried to catch the top of the hour news reports on different stations. So I've got some AM on there, is that it seemed like the ABC network, the only Beatle record they had at hand was P.S. I Love You, because they kept playing that over and over again at like the top of the hour. It's like, geez, boy, you got the wrong pony here. And I heard a lot of the rock and roll album that night, probably more than I'd ever heard on the radio before. That was like not one of my most played John Lennon albums by a long shot. Apart from the unfinished music stuff, that was probably my least played John Lennon record. And that was where I fell in love with Bring It On Home to Me, Send Me Some Loving, was that night from hearing it so often. And thank God, that's a great tune. And I remember hearing Bebop-A-Lula and Stand By Me. And anyway. So that was my night, and eventually I started making a compilation of just the bits from radio that started that, and I never finished it because I just couldn't face it. But somewhere I may still have all that stuff. I'm not even sure. How about you?
Well, first of all, I love the whole shrine idea in the record store. I love that. That's beautiful. So I graduated from college in the spring of 1980. And when I was in college, I wrote record reviews for the school newspaper. And so when I graduated, obviously I stopped that. But when John and Yoko released Double Fantasy after their long break, I thought that would be kind of a great way to close the circle for me, and wanted to submit an album review of that. And I knew a guy at the newspaper. He said, yeah, sure. Even though you've graduated, we'd love to have you submit that. So I was actually still living at home at the time.
Where was home at the time?
Detroit.
Okay.
I was up in my bedroom actually writing a record review of Double Fantasy. And then my younger brother, Kevin, sort of burst into my room while watching Monday Night Football to tell me John Lennon had been shot. And as in my memory, it was determined pretty quickly that he was dead. Again, that's my memory. So I don't really remember anything about what I did next, other than that put my review in a whole different frame of mind. And I was employed at the time. I worked at J. Walter Thompson, an advertising agency. It's funny, you did your dark armband. You know, I was at an advertising agency, so it's not the most traditional or formal kind of office atmosphere. But I put on a 3-piece black suit that I had in the closet. And that was my way of sort of showing my mourning.
Wow.
So we kind of reacted somewhat similar ways with our apparel.
Yeah.
But what else can you say about it? Oh, my.
Do you still have that review?
I do. And actually, I looked at it just prior to us recording because I couldn't remember what I had said. Do you want to know what I said?
Yeah, send it. I'll post it. But yeah, if you want to read a quote from it, sure.
Actually, I'll just send it to you. And in essence, what I said, you know, half the tunes are Yoko, so you have to either enjoy that or not. And of half the tunes that are John, in my opinion, only 3 were sort of worthy.
So you said this even after the news.
Yeah.
Good for you for sticking to your journalistic cred.
I felt I needed to be straight up about it. So for me, watching The Wheels, Woman, and Losing You, I thought were the strongest tracks. And so I talked about those. One of the other things that's funny, we've been talking about this in our Olympiad. One of the other things I said in the review, even though it wasn't John's best work, how wonderful it was just to hear that voice again, just to hear that singing voice. And I put that in the review. That was still true. Just to hear that voice again was so wonderful.
Wow.
I was also complimentary of Jack Douglas's production, which I think a lot of people take issue with, that it's such of its time. I actually still think it's a pretty good, rich production.
It's interesting, yeah. My opinion on the album has definitely shifted over time, but I do read a lot of people condemning it as being sort of yacht rock and all that. I get that. I do remember feeling that on some of the tracks at the time, because I don't know if it's just people have a distaste for that genre, or they thought being John Lennon, it should have been more raw. And I could sort of see that too. But it is interesting that at the time, I thought some of it was a bit slick, but that was like the least of my problems with the album.
Yeah. And no argument that it's slick, but I thought it was a rich sound. And I know people slam John for sort of the whole, isn't it wonderful to be a house husband and married to Yoko thing of that album. But that's what we loved about John. He was authentic to a degree. That was his life. That's what he was thinking. That's what he was doing to a degree. And so I accept that there's an authenticity to that.
Well, maybe the tip of the hand was in plain sight all these years. Double fantasy, not double reality.
All right, that's pretty good. We'll move on from there. Even you were pleased with that one.
Oh, yes.
All right, so we're going to go back to solo careers. I probably should have put this question after the 1976 album, but anyway, Anthony Walmoley asked, did John, George, and Ringo ever consider carrying on as a group without Paul?
In light of the when George walks out, we'll get Clapton in here remark that they saw the Beatles continuing despite the absence of a key member. I think when John was saying that, it was more in light of finishing the project and needing that chair occupied. It's funny, you listen to the dialogue that was taped in the moments after George's walkout, and Michael Lindsay Hogg suggests, well, maybe we could say he was sick. That's why he didn't make the show. So it's funny how people deal different ways with solutions to problems. And I think for John, it was strictly problem solving. Well, let's see what we need to do to get this finished. And that's what happened. So I think that if Paul had left the Beatles in 1969, and I can't imagine any scenario where that would have happened, but if he did, I think that would have been John's excuse to, okay, well, I'm out of here. It's me and Yoko from now on. That's my take. And it might have been like Plastic Ono Band, where he'll work with Ringo or work with George like he did in Imagine. If I need these guys around to support me musically, I know I can always pick up the phone. But I don't see him crafting another Beatle album. I think, in fact, they talk about that in the Flower Pot conversation. I can be Beatles and you can be Beatles. I don't think George can be Beatles or Ringo can be Beatles, something like that. So he's conceptualizing in his head what constitutes Beatles. And as months later would prove, apparently John and Paul constitute Beatles when it comes to recording Ballad of John and Yoko. But maybe that was where he saw it, is you and I, Paul, we're Beatles. And with a breakdown of that, anything less, it's one thing if it's a track on an album like Julia, it's just me. But as far as a brand and crafting an album, John, George, and Ringo, and whoever, I don't think he would call that Beatles. I don't see that as something he'd be clinging to. Now, there is also the quote from Michael on January 13th, where in response to Paul's, if I push him to making a decision between the Beatles and John Yoko, he's going to pick Yoko. And Michael throws in his face, well, John just said the other day, he doesn't not want to be a Beatle, which is an interesting thing. But I don't think that extends to carrying on absent Paul.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom the three of them continuing. I want to ask a follow-up question to that, though. And if I've got my facts right, Paul's announcement in the press, or the press reads Paul's quitting the Beatles. As I understand it, the very next day, John goes out to Friar Park to meet with George without Yoko, which I think Patty or Chris O'Dell said was sort of shocking to see John without Yoko at the time.
Yeah, Chris said that.
and that John and George sort of walk around the garden. And my guess is they're trying to come to grips with the announcement and how they feel about it and how they want to react to it. Do you have any thoughts about what they said or any conclusions they came to?
The only thing I could think of is that you're trying to get on the same page and get the story settled between them of how they would deal with it. But apart from Don Short's headline in the paper, Paul McCartney quits the Beatles, you read Paul's interview and there's nothing in there that says he quits the Beatles. It's all indefinite, open-ended. I don't foresee a time. I'm having better time with my family. Who knows? The future will tell, that kind of thing. It's all very non-committal. But it's shocking to read that in the context of the apparent disunity within the Beatles that the public was not really privy to that point. Now, Don Short, in his defense, said, I talked to people at Apple that said for sure Paul had quit the group. And if you try to parse that out, well, what can that mean? Well, we know that since the September 20th I Want a Divorce thing, Paul had stopped showing up at Apple, right? And then on the heels of that, when the Life reporters confront him in Campbellton to see if he's still alive, and there's that quote that appeared in the November 7th, 69 Life magazine, the Beatles thing is over. People have been debating that ever since. Does he mean the group is finished, or Beatles writ large as you know them, we're not that anymore? It's different Beatles going forward. I'm more inclined these days to think the latter than the former was his meaning, that they were being open-ended and that the next time you see Beatles, it's going to be not what you've seen to this point, which goes back to what I was answering earlier about a 76 Beatles album, that I think the four-headed monster thing and what we knew as Beatles to that point, if they ever did it again, it wouldn't be as it had been. It would be different.
What makes you take that latter approach that Paul is talking about the Beatles would carry on, but not the Beatles as we knew them? What's your basis for that, Robert?
So his full quote is, I would rather do what I began by doing, which is making music. We make good music. So we make good music and we want to go on making good music. Okay? We. But the Beatle thing is over. It has been exploded, partly by what we have done and partly by other people. We are individuals, all different. John married Yoko. I married Linda. We didn't marry the same girl. So I read that as the unanimity that existed prior to was no longer there because they were remembering they've outgrown it, perhaps. We make good music and we want to go on making good music. He can only be speaking of Beatles, right? Because Paul and Linda have not made music to that point. So that, I think, is what tipped it to me thinking he's foreseeing a different form of Beatles going forward. That's not what it had been.
Yeah, I don't interpret it that way. When I hear him refer to we, I think he's referring to the other Beatles, and we are going to make music individually. That's how I hear it.
Well, he never clarified. And I don't think anybody ever called him out on it, which is a curious thing. That's journalism 101, the follow-up. What do you mean by it, Paul? What do you mean the Beatles is over?
But then again, didn't Paul just throw a bucket of slop on them or something?
I think that was when they showed up, and then he agreed to give them their pictures and their quotes in exchange for being left alone.
Yeah, but maybe the journalists were PSTD or something. All right, so moving along then. Next question. This comes from John Frederick from Eugene, Oregon.
Hey, I know somebody from Eugene.
John?
No, somebody going way back out of the blue. Anyway, just as an aside, that's an interesting place because I don't know anything about Eugene, Oregon, but the person I know happens to have ended up in Eugene, Oregon. So interesting.
All right. Anyway, John asks, there are a lot of Beatle misquotes, misconceptions, and things that are attributed to them that are just untrue.
Like John singing the Oz on A Day in the Life?
Speaking of John, that John never said Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. So his question, what are your examples of false facts you wished would just be squashed forever?
The one that comes to my mind, for what it's worth, it started, best I can tell, with Alan Williams' book, which I recommend every Beatle fan should read because it's laugh out loud funny and very vivid, but with the caveat that it's historic fiction. Okay? The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away. It's a great, great book. I wish that's the one that would make into a film, but they haven't yet, and I hope someday they do. But apparently it started there that Stuart Sutcliffe was so poor an instrumentalist and never got better that he would disguise this by playing with his back to the audience. And the pictures they use as support are the ones from the Johnny Gentle audition for backing band in May 1960, the Larry Parnes thing where he's trotting out all these Liverpool bands. There's a series of pictures taken. And there's a couple of them where Stewart, sure enough, has got his back to the camera while John and Paul are up front. And I have seen interpretations that because he's facing his own amp, that he's trying to see if he's in tune, or he's very concerned about that. Whereas in Hamburg, where they've got months of playing together experience under their belt, there's pictures taken at the Top 10 Club showing Stewart on stage fully facing forward and singing, and just a fully integrated frontline member of the band, not doing anything like hiding away. And to me, the best evidence, with the caveat that sometimes the people that were there are the worst witnesses, nonetheless, you have Klaus Vormann and Pete Best, for starters, saying that, was he John Entwistle? No, but he was competent, he was rocking, he was a good, solid rock bass player. Maybe the same way Pete Best was a solid rock drummer. You know, he certainly didn't hold them back when they were becoming the most popular band in the Liverpool-Hamburg circuit in their club days, right? Which is not to say he would have had the finesse to do well in a recording studio going forward if it had come out to that. So I think the thing about being terrible and playing with his back to the audience is just ridiculous, but a lot of people still believe it because there's that picture and that just cements it in their head. And people that were there said, no, he was competent, he got decent. And the fact was he sat in with other bands in Hamburg after he split from the Beatles and they went back to Liverpool, and apparently gave Klaus rudimentary lessons on bass when Klaus decided to take it up. So there's that. It's just one of those things that gets repeated by lazy people without looking into it or thinking critically about it. And I think it's a bit of a stain on his name, but maybe people find it a more satisfying story that he was there for his buddy John, but really he was an artist and not meant to be a musician. Therefore, not the Beatles' loss that he didn't carry on with them. I don't know. But to me, if you're a musician, the whole story that if anybody's bad on their stringed instrument that they would turn away, that's really what's going to tell you somebody's lousy, not your ears.
My guess is your list of falsehoods that you would want to correct is quite long. What else is on that list?
Oh, I don't know. Name something. That Emmerich's book is a true history of recording the Beatles.
Okay. I'd never heard, by the way, that Klaus Vormann got some bass lessons from Stu Sutcliffe. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, they were quite tight up until he died. Despite his carrying on with Astrid at that point, apparently Klaus was good-natured about it.
Yeah. My guess is one that would be at the top of your list, saying what you just said and listening to this podcast through the years, that Ringo's a subpar drummer. You'd want to put that to bed.
We spent a lot of sappy real estate picking through that stuff and getting people who know what's what that are professional musicians. It's like if you see quotes demeaning him as a drummer, 99 and 9/10% of the time is from people that aren't musicians. And when you're good at something, you make it look easy.
True.
Untrained ears, you listen to a Neil Peart, you think, now that's a drummer. Well, how well do you think that would have worked in the Beatles? Because he played to the song and enhanced it and added hooks and color to it. It's a distinction that I think we get spoiled by because you've had decades of listening to his music and you just think, well, of course he would. That's just what you do, right? Not going back further and listening to previous rock drummers that basically know two styles, you know, a fast song or a slow song. If they're at all educated, maybe they know a Latin beat or a jazz time or something like that. But Ringo was eminently adaptable to whatever situation you threw him into. And to me, what's most impressive is some of his most amazing work was post-touring. When they're not on the road slogging through these, granted, half-hour sets, but they might be twice a day, every day for 3 weeks, more or less, something like that. A Day in the Life, Strawberry Fields, amazing, amazing standout drumming for a guy who's only called upon to contribute when they're ready to track the song.
No argument from me. All right, so two falsehoods. It's the early rhythm section. Well, no, the rhythmist, I guess, Stu Sutcliffe and Ringo Starr. I think that pulls it to a close with questions. What great questions from your listeners. And I love the fact that one of your listeners even pulls in a direct quote to sort of set up his question.
Yes, I love that. And I'm very grateful that we've got such smart, deep, informed, thoughtful listeners. I've never taken that for granted, but when you have stuff like this in your face, it just brings the point home. And you see it in the comments people make on the shows and things like that. So anybody with further questions, and I know there's got to be, SATB2010, SATB2010 at Gmail is the place to send your questions. And we will do another show like this. I promise you, sooner than it took to get this one together. But I really enjoy this because it just is so all over the place. You've probably had the same experience as a public speaker at libraries as have I. You do your presentation, and for me, the favorite part has always been the last half hour to 45 minutes or hour, depending on how you slice it, where you take questions from the people there. That's absolutely the most fun part for me.
Totally agree. Because you don't know where it's going to go, and it's fun to see where people's head is at. Absolutely. That's the best part of that.
And once you learn how to BS with sincerity, you got it made.
There you go. There's another winner for you, Robert.
Uh-huh. Anyway, check out Gary's site and think about some good questions. And as I said, ending the show will be the discussion with Jerry and Luther regarding A Day in Life, to circle back to things if you haven't heard it yet. And hopefully that resolves it to at least the people that are open-minded and willing to learn something.
Great. Thanks, Robert.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis. We started this conversation, a discussion when we were kind of getting ready for the show, wanting to lay to rest something that's been out there. And to the extent that it may be knowable, if there's forensics to be traced, or perhaps settle on the conclusion that maybe it's not entirely knowable, it's good to know that too. But history is seldom black and white, one thing or the other, no matter how much fans out there want to pitch it as such, especially when it comes to the Beatles, especially when it comes to John versus Paul battles. Everybody's got their partisans and they've got their deeply held opinions, no matter what the evidence may point to. And one of those things is the ahs heard after the middle eighth of A Day in the Life, after the woke up, fell out of bed part. You don't have to go very far online, just to Google Oz, A Day in the Life, to find many pitched battles, one side or the other. And I thought, you know what? I got some people here that know a thing or two about recording, that know how to listen to stems, that know what may be the chain of evidence when it comes to documentation of the breakdown of the tracks. So how about an informed opinion for a change on who's doing the Oz to the extent that it's knowable?
I'll take a run at that. So I never in my books really made a declarative statement about any of that. The day of the recording for Paul's vocal, which he was replacing a take that was done earlier.
The oh shit one.
Yeah, the oh shit take that he was replacing. All the Beatles were in the studio. We know that. Mercifully, through the Rock Band stems that came out post-2009, we have well-isolated vocal tracks that are available to us, and that section in particular. What you hear in those vocal tracks is you hear three Beatles. You hear Paul, John, and George around the microphone. John is the voice that does the in the middle of it, after the woke up, got out of bed section.
Wow.
And as they move into the ahs, you hear very faintly, but they are present. You hear a falsetto vocal, and you hear kind of a little bit of just a goofy vocal going on in tandem with the more formal scale of the ahs. My contention is both the tone of the voice and the intonation lead me to McCartney singing it. You hear a breath being taken right before going into it, which is from the primary vocal. So that tells me that the primary vocalist was gearing up to perform that part, and that's McCartney.
Right after Went Into a Dream.
Yeah, Went Into a Dream. You hear that. And the falsetto has Lennon's kind of a little bit of a comic nature to it as well. So those things together tell me that Lennon isn't singing it. What I believe has gone on to influence this discussion and this confusion and this lack of ability to really nail it down was the choice by Martin to switch from a very dry vocal that McCartney was performing up to that point into that very dense repeat echo that happens during that section.
Not to mention it's not as dark I guess intentionally dark. Woke up out of bed.
Yeah, the woke up, got out of bed section, it's really wonderful stylistically and symbolically that vocal is very muddy and mid-rangey and dry.
You wanted it groggy, I guess.
Yeah, it's like the fog of waking up, right? That, there's no crispness to it. It's a very dull, kind of dry vocal. That we return to the vocal sound that starts the song with Lennon singing. That, I think, to our brains is a clue that it's Lennon again, even if it isn't Lennon again.
Exactly.
We kind of tell ourselves it is because that was the voice that had all the repeat echo on it. So if we hear repeat echo again, it's got to be John, right?
Right. It's a switch in what had just been happening.
It's a switcheroo.
Yeah.
So
conceptually is I went into a dream and here's what it sounded like.
Exactly. Now,
Totally.
if we look at it from the narrative point of view, it would have to be McCartney singing it because McCartney's the guy who woke up and got out of bed and went into a dream.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that aspect of it. But I believe from the available audio that McCartney is the vocalist on it of the primary ahs that are going on there. And again, our brains are a little bit tricked by the production choices that they made to go back to the repeat echo that we associate with Lennon.
Right.
Yeah, and there's ways that he reaches when he sings that is just so clearly McCartney that just John wouldn't do.
Like the intro to Lovely Rita?
Kind of like that, yeah, exactly.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
That's what it reminds me exactly of. And
yeah, great analogy.
I'm pretty positive it's Paul. I mean, but I can see someone like George or John sort of bolstering it in some way, because then I can see them, why wouldn't they do that? They're being creative and they're sitting around a mic and they're probably high and like, let's just do something weird behind his vocal,
And they are. If listeners out there can get their hands on the Rock Band stems, and they'll hear for themselves the three vocalists around it. And you wouldn't even know, in the density of that mix, because that's when the orchestra starts to well up again, that there are three vocalists that are singing there.
Yes.
For the repeat echo that comes around the main vocal, you lose those other two voices completely. But they're there. I contend they're not McCartney. They're Lennon and Harrison that are doing having the fun in the background while McCartney actually has to perform.
Totally.
Right. I assume that effect is printed on the tape and it's not something that you can hear dry.
Yeah, no, it's printed. Just like they printed the repeat echo on Lennon's voice right from the top.
Yes.
It was recorded that way, which frankly in 1967, that was not always the way that they did things. They were more inclined to add sweetening sorts of effects, chamber, plates, ADT and that sort of thing at the mixing point at remix. But yeah, in post. But here was a situation where Lennon, and this is throughout Lennon's career, it actually went on through the 70s in his recordings where he rhythmically played off of and cued off of the effects that were added to his voice. So that slap back echo, repeat echo that was going on with The Day in the Life, he used that to influence his phrasing and intonation on the song.